here in, what's the name of this place? This area? Kopan. I'm in Kopan interviewing my favorite Yogācāra scholar at the moment, Bill Waldron. So thank you, Bill, for our course.
Sure.
It's very nice to meet you. And Bill is also hosting us here in his beautiful house in a very quiet place near the vicinity of Bodha Stupa. So Bill, if I may, I'm wondering, how did you meet Buddhism in general, and how did you find Yogācāra in particular?
Yeah, I always get this question.
Mhm.
So, and you know, it sounds like a cliche maybe, but I had a angsty teenage life, full of unhappiness when I was a teenager. There was a lot of trouble, nationally, socially, culturally, and in my family and my neighbors and stuff. A lot of problems with alcohol and drugs, even from a very prosperous community. And so I just didn't adapt very well to that worldview. And so this is when I really started to understand about the depth of dukkha in human life. And then I started to try to figure out, why. Anyways, I read a lot of stuff by existentialists, and then depth psychologists, Freud and Jung, and of course other political kinds of things, like Vietnam War was going on, a lot of Marxism, things on black nationalism.
Where were you, by the way?
I was in a white suburb of Detroit, just across the city line. So that itself, that whole dichotomy and bifurcation, racial bifurcation, is such a awful part of the U.S. It was like right in my face. But I also had a really strong attraction to black music. Motown is the other name for Detroit. And so there's a lot of great music there. So I was well primed, you could say, for when I first was introduced to Buddhism. There's suffering, there are causes of suffering. The way out and stuff was not so obvious at that time. I don't think it's so obvious now for lots of people. But the pervasiveness of suffering and its causes was something I already was kind of looking for, really, understanding the causes. So when I first started reading about Buddhism, I was already meditating. And it's like, oh my God, that's it. They got it right. They got it right. Nobody even I knew in the U.S. was like that. So I thought, Asia, these people have it right. I should go to Asia. So I spent a couple of years way out in the dark, in the deep woods in northern Michigan, learning how to meditate, kind of.
Just by himself?
Yeah, just my sister was there for a little while, but
Do you have a book?
and a friend. I read little books here and there. What the Buddha taught was famous.
Mm-hmm.
I read some Mahāyāna stuff.
So at that time, I guess there weren't so many translations or books.
There weren't so many, and there weren't so many teachers. So I kind of learned how to meditate just by sitting in the woods next to the water and chilling out. But I didn't have a job, which was really great because I had saved up some money from previous job, and we didn't have a phone or TV, so there was not a lot of distractions. In hindsight, it was on a retreat. So I was done.
But wonderful, actually.
Yeah, and I had no idea what I was doing or where I was going, which I think is still not a bad model. Despite everything. Yeah.
And then how did you meet Yogācāra at that point, or did you make a distinction between?
No, I don't think I I don't remember hearing the word Yogācāra at that point. So I decided to come to India, and this was back in the 70s, India and Nepal. And then on the way I met a Tibetan Lama of the Kargyu tradition, and I immediately went to a refuge. It was a Lama Chime. He was based in England. And so I kind of planted some seeds when I came over here to South Asia in India and Nepal, and ended up meeting Tibetan Lamas, mostly Kargyu, but not only, and Hindu teachers as well. I'm quite curious about things. It took me several years before I realized, being over here, that I decided to go to university. And even at that point, it was unclear what I was going to really focus on, but I sort of drifted towards Indian Buddhism I liked early Buddhism. I liked Indian Mahāyāna a lot. So then I had at some point to decide what to do with my dissertation thesis topic. And at first I was going to do mandalas, the five Buddha mandalas, because I was fascinated by the chaityas all over Kamadru Valley and the pictures, and but then all of the explanations were using Yogācāra terms.
Yeah.
So I thought, I have to learn Yogācāra, And now, how many years later? 30 years later, I'm coming back to the five Buddha.
So finally you reached. By the way, there's a text by my Tripa, in which, are you familiar with it? In which he explains the different views of Yogācāra and Madhyamaka, means of the five Buddhas.
Oh, no, I don't. You have to.
I'll point them.
Yeah, you have to. That would be wonderful. But it was so, having this background in depth psychology, Freud and Jung, and regardless of all of their multiple limitations, the sense that a lot of what is going on in our minds, our psyches, is not conscious, was really obvious to me. So when I kind of moved into doing Yogācāra for my dissertation topic, focusing on Ālaya, the Vijñāna, it was just intuitively obvious. So it was just an easy topic for me, and that was my first book, which was based on my thesis research.
The Buddhist unconscious.
And the Buddhist unconscious, yeah. And the rationale and everything, the systemization of this model of mind that draws on earlier forms of Buddhism, early Buddhism, Abhidharma, just made sense to me because I'd already learned all that vocabulary. And the rationales are very Abhidharmic rationales, at first. Not the metaphors. The metaphors are analogies. The metaphors are not the main doctrine. The Abhidharmic language, the language of dependent arising, is the main focus.
And just for people who are not familiar with the term Yogācāra and also Ālaya, would you just briefly define them?
Yeah, of course. So Yogācāra means practitioners of yoga, and it shows up in the historical record around the 2nd, 3rd century, and it was very productive of texts and practices for a number of centuries in India. And then it became one of the two main schools of Mahāyāna Buddhism, schools in the sense of sort of sets of doctrines and associated practices that really almost all later Mahāyānas studied, or at least were deeply influenced by. The other school, of course, being Madhyamaka, and Nagarjuna is sort of their key figure.
Can we even speak of a unified Yogācāra thing happening in India, or?
Well, can we speak of, this is a good question, can we speak of a unified Madhyamaka? What do we mean when we use these kinds of terms and stuff? So there are a set of sutras, the Sambhinamochana Sutra, the Lankavatara Sutra. There are sets of other texts, the 5 texts of Maitreya, that show up in the historical record 4th, 5th century of the Common Era. A set of shastras, or treatises, written by Vasubandhu and Asanga and other people after them. So, and they started to use this term, Yogācāra. So, I mean, I think this is always something we should question from a kind of historical point of view. What kind of coherence does a tradition have? And at that point, when they're first sort of showing up in the historical record and these texts are sort of coming out, there wasn't this clear sense of this is one school and that's another school. Even at that time, there wasn't a clear sense that there was a Madhyamaka school. This comes later, a couple of centuries after, many centuries after Nagarjuna, a couple of centuries after Asanga and Vasubandhu, the people who wrote a lot of the classic treatises. So a lot of our perspective, I think you're anticipating this, is that we're kind of looking at it after the fact and projecting anachronistically onto this historical phenomenon, these schools. And this is one of the reasons we start to think about them as really quite separate and different.
And then from that perspective, what would be the glue besides these sutras that you mentioned, Lankavatara, Sambhinamochana, and the five treatises doctrinally, or what is the glue that holds this Yogācāra idea together?
So the Yogācāra is a sort of, well, especially a Yogācāra Bhumi, which is attributed, a long text attributed to Asanga. A set of ideas that are sort of distinctive to the Yogācāra tradition. Ālaya Vijñāna, which is translated into English as a storehouse consciousness. And it is a stream of awareness, of sentience. It's also called Cittasantana in other Indian traditions, that in a sense carries along with it, stream is an analogy, carries along with it potentialities for karma to ripen and the dispositions for our afflictions, our Kleśas, which is a notion that is common to all Indian Buddhists as far as I know. It's a stream of mind that goes through one lifetime to the next, connected with karmic potentiality and dispositions to Kleśas. So what this theory or this way of thinking about mind articulates is that a lot of those processes are going on non-consciously, but they then become the supporting kind of processes for which we have conscious awareness. So we're conscious of sensation, we're conscious of sight, conscious of words, etc. And these are underpinned, you could say, by all these other processes, including potentiality to have certain kinds of experience because of karma in our own afflictive dispositions.
So can we think of the Ālaya's notion and the Vasanas, the dispositions, as the waves? Or what would be a good metaphor?
So the metaphor in the Viññaptimātra Sutra is that this is a current, and that the waves are up on top, the waves of sensation, sensory awareness, etc., that often come, you might say, buffeted by the winds from outside. But we have these underlying currents which also support these waves. And so Vasana is translated in different ways: impressions, impregnations, dispositions. This is part of our motivational structure, right? So we have these Kleśas, these afflictions, greed, anger, lust, things like ignorance, of course. And these don't really disappear until we're fully awakened. So part of any robust account of what a person is and how we exist and live through time is what happens with all of these before we're awakened, And if we were constantly angry, we wouldn't have many friends. But we also wouldn't get any good karma, right? Because we'd be angry all the time. But just so somebody does something very, very generous or kind or whatever, they still are said to have this disposition to anger until far along the path. So how is that functioning, as it were? And so this is why this idea of dispositions is really important. They don't disappear, as it were, even if they're not manifest moment to moment.
In your book, you use this term that it really got me thinking. I think you call them feedback loops.
Yeah.
Because is that the same? Is that how you would describe a vasana, in the sense that it's perpetuating itself?
Well, we want to, always avoid the idea of something perpetuating itself, right? I mean, in the sense that it would be self-created, as Nagarjuna critiqued. So this gets back. I didn't finish, of course, talking about what else is in Yogācāra, but that's okay. What I see the model is one that we see early on in early tradition about the 12 links, independent arising. The 12 links are kind of the complex formula, and in the early text there's sometimes 7, 8, 9, whatever. It's not always 12. That became kind of standard, and the more you dig into it, the more you sort of realize that some of these links between lifetimes are kind of problematic. So Abhidharmists and the people who wanted to systematize things much, much more than the Buddha did, focus on these links and between lifetimes, and there's a lot of discussion. So the more you dig into that, in one level, the more complicated it gets. But the general gist of it is that we do have certain actions, karma, that lives to certain results, and those results are sort of pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, and we respond to those results with a certain kind of affliction, aversion or avoidance or greed, right? Typically we want to avoid unpleasant things and we want to hold on to pleasant things. And that instigates an action. So there's three parts to it, really. There's the action, the result, the response, the reaction, and then a new action. And that is the feedback cycle. And so we wouldn't want to say that one part of that, reproduces itself. It's a cycle with different components that can be broken. And that's the whole point of what the Buddha is saying. This creates habit patterns. But habit patterns are complex and they have different components and they can be broken. So even if we're hangry, we don't have to act out on it, or if we're lustful, we don't have to act out on it. And people who are much more realized can feel pleasure and not even want more. Just like, they say, oh, that's good, now it's gone, it's impermanent. Or if they feel bad, they don't try to avoid it. So this is part of, I think, how the practice goes there. And so the Kleśas, our reaction patterns, are latent, or they're at the dispositional level until we get awakened, which means they're sort of always in some level of potentiality. And then when something comes into our sense field that we react to, in a sense, they become woken up. Pariyavastaniya is a dharma. This is from the Abhidharma Kosha, a dharma of something in our sense field that triggers. It's almost exactly triggered. It leads to the arising or outburst of a Kleśa. So it's what pushes our buttons. I mean, we have these analogies in English that are almost the same. So it's kind of always there, but then something triggers them. And so this is where the whole question about dispositions and then karmic potentials, potential for karma to ripen at a later time. How do we sort of think about how these persist in this stream and not always interfering with what we're consciously aware of and what our intentions and motivations are? And this became a real issue 3rd, 4th century in India. And not just with the Buddhists. This is the same time period that Patanjali is putting together the Yoga Sutras. And the vocabulary in the Yoga Sutras, 2/3 are the same as you see in Yogācāra. And they're also dealing with, they borrowed, I think, the cycle action, result, reaction from the Buddhists. I can't say for sure, but who borrowed what. But they're trying to also deal with this question about how do you have this continuity of dispositions of potentiality, despite what's going on at the conscious level. And so the Ālaya Vijñana model is, the analogy with the stream and the currents that are less affected by moment-to-moment changes, less affected, sort of persist along from one life, during a lifetime and one lifetime to the next, buffeted by all of our sensory kinds of experiences.
And where does Vikalpa come into the picture in this model? Would you talk a little bit about this?
So, part of that you could say that comes under the category of ignorance, in a sense. Part of the Kleśas is going to be greed and aggression and ignorance, roughly speaking. And then we have structures. We have cognitive structures. This is the way that I kind of think about this, that get built up over time. And all of this gets built up over time. Our whole bodies, right, don't get built up over time, not just because we, start off as just a couple little cells, but human beings as a species gets built up over time, and the various sensory organs that we have, etc., had antecedents, if you think in terms of evolution. They get built up over time. And the term that is really important in Indian traditions, and especially Buddhism, samskaras. The samskaras are formations. And these karmic formations, it's often translated as, which is like, because in the 5 skandhas, really what samskara refers to is intention, cetana. But it also has a much broader sense. So all of our sense faculties are really just structures that operate in certain kinds of ways. But so are mental faculties. If we think about, I use a lot of parallels with cognitive science to help make sense of this for me, and hopefully for other people as well. We have mental structures, right? Like you think about, right now you're not having any problem understanding me, I hope.
I hope so.
You hope not.
I hope not.
Right? And I mean, your English is very good. Your syntax, you don't have to think about the structures of my sentences, right? Etc. That's because you've learned them all. They become neurologically embedded, right? None of us knew a language at the day we're born. We're familiar with our mom's voice. This we know. But we don't know these languages. We don't know terms. We don't know words and syntax. These become structured, neurologically embedded. And I think about this deeply as a way that to think about samskaras, right? And so that they operate automatically. But operating automatically means that's not conscious. This is part of the structure of, or part of, you might say, of what is associated with this stream of mind that we call Ālaya vijñāna, which is actually a set of a whole bunch of different kinds of processes. Ālaya arises based on past samskaras is one term that it comes up in the text, or one phrase. So Vikalpa is one part of that. And Vikalpa is one part of that in the sense that our way of categorizing the world is not only sort of, not only do you have this tendency to develop human sensory faculties, if we're not impaired for some kind of reason developmentally, but we also interact developmentally in certain kinds of ways. And so we automatically sort of see things. I do this in my classroom all the time. Everybody knows what this is. But a one-day-old baby doesn't know what this is. And they can't even see the back of it. They can't infer that there's a back. And we automatically do that all the time. To me, that's a kind of Vikalpa. It's not the way that the Buddhist tradition talk about it, but I think this is how we have to think about it.
In that case, the perception, the fact that we're perceiving this object is in itself a Vikalpa. I guess we should say Vikalpa is conceptuality, I guess.
Yeah.
That's how you would translate it.
But we need to think about Vikalpa as categorization also, not simply conceptuality. It's not, I don't think it's exclusively linguistic. I mean, it depends upon the text and who you're talking about.
But in that case, for example, of the bottle, before I have the thought and the labeling of it as a bottle, the image, the Ākāraḥ, the nampa, that's also considered to be Vikalpa?
Yeah.
Then Vikalpa has much broader
I think so.
application.
In my understanding, yes. So the Ākāraḥ, the aspect of it, so to speak, is something that is not just simply given, it's also learned, right? Because we would, again, I'm using an analogy in cognitive science, a neonate, a newborn baby's retina cells are not wired up. They can't put these different images and different stimuli together into these shapes. The neurons have to fire multiple times. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Do you know this expression? Yeah. So even to see an object, it's already a complex cognitive process that requires learning and neurological embedding to see a distinctive object. And I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of the discussion about what objects are in Yogācāra is not very deeply thought through. From any modern point of view of cognitive science, an object that we're aware of is already a product of complex cognitive processes in interaction with an environment. There is no pure object out there like some empiricism or something like that. So when one of the main points in Yogācāra, this is distinctive doctrine, Vijñaptimātra, right, as you know. And this would be, to my understanding of this, and people obviously disagree, or especially the traditions disagree with this a lot, but my understanding of that's a recognition that all apparent objects are already constructs. They're constructs based upon the structures that are built up over time through our engagement with an environment, including our human species-specific potentialities to develop sense organs in a certain kind of way. And it's a recognition that the world is not the way that it appears. It's just a perception, which is not an ontological claim. It's a critical concept that says we can't take the world at face value. Because if we were colorblind, we would see something different. If we had some impaired, other kinds of so-called impairment, that is something that's different than what is sort of statistically normal, we would see things differently. The bacteria that are growing in here, that happens all the time. And the bacteria in there, they don't see this as a water bottle. And they don't probably see it as much of anything. Whatever they can eat, they're going to eat, right? And so from that point of view, it's just so obvious that objects are not what they appear. And I really think that's what the Vijñaptimātra means. And if you look at the analogies and stuff that Vasubandhu talks about, that seems clear to me.
Does he present Vijñaptimātra as a more, of course, we first need to get a grasp of the main concepts of Yogācāra that you're explaining, for example, the Ālaya in this case, Vikalpa, etc. And then I would get the sense that Vijñaptimātra is presented more from a practice perspective. Like, this is how you apply it. Is this how it's presented in the text, or?
It includes that. For sure, it includes that. As the scholastic treatises, the Shastras and stuff that are written in Indian Buddhism, and that's my main, study. A lot of times they sort of assume, there's a lot of things that are assumed. They're assuming the word of the Buddha is authoritative. They're assuming the whole, whatever has developed up until the time that they're writing. And they sort of pick out certain topics to discuss, you could say. But the framework is, yes, why are we doing this? We're doing this because we're ignorant, because we're driven by our afflictions, and that makes us suffer. These are the causes of suffering, and we need to be able to see through that. And so then a lot of the discussion often kind of takes place, you might say, at the graduate level, right? Where everybody's already has those assumptions, and now they're just sort of arguing about how to explain it better, often. But, and so in this sense, I think one of the concerns that Asanga has in the first chapter of the Mahāyānasaṅgraha is, it's really clear, I think one of his concerns is, why is this a better way of explaining the continuity of karmic potential and the afflicted dispositions? Why is this a better way? And then there's a whole bunch of ways in which he says, if we only think that there are the five sense modes of awareness plus mind, then we can't account for continuity over time. So in a certain sense, and this is the arguments that go on, just like one after the other. So these are very academic or logical, philosophical kinds of arguments. But the larger framework, of course, is one of practice. And so this is a good kind of segue to talk about my understanding of the three natures. And that, again, the three natures is one of the distinctive, you could say, signature concepts of Yogācāra, Ālaya, Vijñāna, Vijñaptimātra, and then the three natures. And just as a short digression, the other two things that are really important about the Yogācāra tradition is that they systematize the Bodhisattva path. Part of the Yogācāra Bhumi is the Shravaka Bhumi and the Bodhisattva Bhumi. And then there's a text actually called the Buddha Bhumi Sutra. And then they systematize the three bodies of the Buddha. So one really important part of the Yogācāra tradition, which really becomes then pan-Mahāyāna doctrines, is the three Bodhisattva paths and then three Buddha bodies. But so the third signature doctrine, you might say, of Yogācāra is then the three natures, right? And that's even more than these other two, Ālaya Vijñāna and other two concepts, Ālaya Vijñāna and Viñaptimātra. The three natures, the Trisvabhāva, is really a moving target. So which text just defines them in what way? And they just kind of move around from text to text and century to century. So it can be really hard to have a good handle on what that's all about. And then later on, they get used in ways that I that I find really kind of odd, in later Indian Buddhism. I don't really understand what
which period?
Yeah. 9th, 10th century. The stuff's that Dan and I talk about. Yeah, exactly. But early on, and if we think about it sort of in a very simple way, it's the first nature, parikalpita, or abhuta parikalpita svabhāva. The things that we imagine exist, like unchanging entities and essences, right? That's the problem, right? To me, I understand it as a definition of the problem. We see this. So then the question is, why do we see it? And this is the classic Yogācāra question, I think. We see this because we have the dispositions, the Vikalpa, the nama, the nimitta, Vikalpa, Vyavahara, the whole set of concepts that dependently arise in our mental stream, and they help to construct the way that we experience the world, including reifying experience into imagined essences. So the second nature, the dependent nature, is in the Samdhinamochana Sutra, is word for word dependent arising. This is something that you don't often see in the discussion. But what that means is that the reason that we impute or imagine things in terms of essence is that we have these dispositions as part of our cognitive processes, the Saṃskāras, the structures that have been built up over time in order to see essences. And so this is an explanation then of why we imagine there are essences. And then the third nature is to be able to cut through those predispositions to reify, to essentialize, to cut through them. And this is where the meditative practices, come in. How do we learn to cut through that? And Vijñaptimātra is one of these meditation practices. What is going on with a perception? Is it something that has a one-to-one correspondence with the world that we can somehow verify? If so, then why does it change all the time? And we can think about why are there illusions? Why does the world have? We see on the highway mirages, right? Because the light waves change. We have all kinds of different ways in which our sensory faculties are not very reliable and systematic. I mean, they're okay most of the time. But the idea of these types of meditations is to undermine our confidence that what we see is what is actually out there. And this is lots of meditation, of course, does that. Analytic meditations, concentration meditations, fasting, sleeplessness, all kinds of all the methods for creating altered states of consciousness, right? So that falls within. To me, I think of that as part of the framework of the three natures.
That's very interesting. So then would you, just to rephrase it, would you say that the first two natures are the theory and the third nature is the application? One way to think of it, maybe?
Getting from the second to the third, yes.
Yeah.
Undermining our propensity to reify and being able to see things clearly, with non-conceptual wisdom. That's where the whole practice orientation comes in. But in a sense, the other two are kind of pointing to what we need to look at, right? Here's a reification when we're imagining things have essences. We need to examine that, but we need to examine why we think that way. And this is something that in cognitive science I found really interesting. And I quote a lot of this here and there in the books, in my book. Cognitive scientists mostly would say, no, we don't see the world directly as it is. And we don't see light waves, for example, and we don't see atoms. There's all kinds of stuff we don't see. And we also impute that there are essences. Why? And the answer that the cognitive scientists have is we do that because it has been functional for us to imagine things have these certain kinds of essences. Typical example is a dark spot at night or when it's starting to get dark on the path and it moves. Is it a bear or is it just a bush in the wind? If we get this wrong, it could be very dangerous. So it's better to overcompensate and think that something that is moving by itself is an animate thing, is potentially dangerous. So its essence would be as something animate. So we just learn to categorize very, very early on. And then, because of course humans are very smart, we reify these categories. So where was I going with that?
We're talking about the practice.
Yeah. So, so the cognitive scientists say that we are born to be naive realists and naive essentialists. This is part of our dispositions as human beings. So it's something that needs to be acknowledged. And then that throws us into the question of how does mind operate? How do our minds operate? And at least in classical Yogācāra, what they say is dependent arising is the best way to kind of address and get a handle on how these processes operate. And so that's why then the path to liberation focuses on dependent arising. And this is something that is often not very emphasized in presentations of Cittamātra or Yogācāra, how important dependent arising is. Yeah. But then these become, open up to the path.
Because in a way, all the structures and all the processes described in Yogācāra are dependent arising, basically. They can be described in terms of Pratitya-samuppada, no? So perfect match, I guess.
Yes, this is sort of the theme of this paper that I shared with you the other day, that the Buddha, Nagarjuna, Vasubandhu, and Sambhimmocha in the sutra says dependent arising is central. And that's the dependent nature. And so this is not a claim that mind in some fashion exists substantially, as the later Tenet system talks about. In fact, that's a way of reading Yogācāra ideas from the point of view of the imagined nature. It's if the Yogācārans are talking about essential entities rather than dependently arisen phenomenon. Yeah.
How are these ideas received by modern cognitive scientists?
So your question was, how are these ideas received by contemporary?
Yeah, like how is the contemporary scientific community from the neuroscience, or I guess not necessarily neuroscientific, but cognitive science in general? I know I understand cognitive science is an umbrella term for psychology, neurology, etc.
Right. Cognitive science is kind of an umbrella.
So, like, amongst these, how are these ideas received, and who would you say are the most receptive? How could these ideas enhance their own fields of knowledge?
I don't want to be terribly discouraging, but by and large, my experience, by and large, with some exceptions, a lot of contemporary scientists, we live in a competitive, they work in competitive fields, right? And in their competitive fields, they need to publish, they need to get grant money, they need to publish within the status quo of their field. And so they don't get a lot of encouragement to go far outside their field. And I think a lot of people in scientific psychology, for example, are really skeptical in general of meditation and things like that. But that has, in the last 20, 30 years with mindfulness, that has changed a lot, at least amongst a certain group of people. And then the neuroscience of meditation and stuff, of course, with Richard Davis and the Wisconsin. But what has happened in terms of Yogācāra is, and this is one of the things that I find really unfortunate, is Yogācāra has a lot of Buddhism, South Asian Buddhism, not East Asian, not Zen, but a lot of Chan and Zen. But South Asian Buddhism, a lot of it was introduced by the Gelugpas, and early on, because they're very academic oriented, and people who studied were then getting these jobs in academic institutions, and so their understanding of Yogācāra in the traditional Tenet system is very strong. And their understanding of Yogācāra is called Cittamātra. And the basic idea there that they think that Yogācārans say that mind exists substantially. Objects are empty of their own existence, their own Svabhāva, but mind is not. Everything is a simple projection of mind, which is a kind of classical idealist notion that we have in the West. It's just like Berkeley. The University of Berkeley is named after him, actually. We call it Berkeley. But, and my wife actually heard broccoli, so she asked me once, how do you spell broccoli when you were in Berkeley? She said, we're in broccoli now. It's a little hard to, to hear. Anyways, so that's their interpretation of Yogācāra and it's a little bit later than classical Yogācāra, and the whole Tenet system got built up centuries later. But they would say that everything is a projection of mind, which is substantially existent. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that dependent arising is an interaction of processes of engagement, of embodied awareness in an environment. And so far as Yogācārans replicate the model of dependent arising, which they Vasubandhu and Asanga very clearly do when they treat these concepts systematically, not just using sort of analogies and metaphors here and there. When they treat it systematically, it's all about an interaction. Ālaya Vijñāna is embodied. It's something that occurs in a body, in an environment, and it has subliminal objects, the shared external world, the bhajana loka.
So it's implicit in that case.
It's explicit.
It's explicit.
It's explicit. This is the weird thing. It's not implicit. And people don't look at that. They think that somehow this term Ālaya Vijñāna is like this isolated, standalone consciousness, and the world is the movie that it projects out, which is not the view of dependent arising. The view of dependent arising is, given our predispositions, our Vāsanā, bhakchak, given our dispositions to afflictions, we experience the world in a certain kind of way. Just like neonates don't see a water bottle. We see a water bottle because we have the Vikalpa of water bottle, and we can grasp it, right? That we know what it's for, something that satisfies our desires. So the interactive process is built into the Yogācāra model. So it couldn't be a rejection of realism or a rejection of objectivism, and therefore an affirmation of subjectivism. That's what people think. That's just not at all what the Yogācārans are saying. But that's how it's been introduced into the West until very recently.
That's also a big misunderstanding with this relation to this term Karmic, Svasaṃvedana. I've read some Western scholars that are explaining it as a kind of subjectivity, but it really seems to seem to be missing the point that Karmic has a different. It's like the glue between subject and object, as I understand it. Would you say a little bit about Svasaṃvedana?
I haven't studied that an awful lot, to tell you the truth.
But it's a Yogācāra doctrine in overall?
Well, it's back to your first question about what is the coherence of this term Yogācāra. Later on, a little bit after Vasubandhu and Asanga, our dates are not really clear, but 4th century, maybe probably 4th, 5th century. And a little bit after that were Dignaga and Dharmakirti. And they dealt with a whole different sets of issues, of questions. They don't talk about Ālaya Vijñāna very much. They don't talk about three natures very much. They talk about Vijñaptimātra very much. They talk about, logic, pramana, right? And Svasaṃvedana, self-awareness. So they are often considered to be Yogācārans, but I'm not really sure exactly why that is. I'm sure there's some people know from historical reasons. But so you maybe know more about Svasaṃvedana than I do. It seems like you.
And what are the
good sense of what it?
Not really. That's why I'm asking. I was wondering what you thought.
Yeah.
Because I have seen this come up regularly in the context of Yogācāra, Svasaṃvedana. Then I guess that also makes me curious to know how did these ideas develop in a way that you find does not resonate with, let's say, classical Yogācāra or Asanga Vasubandhu? What happened in India even after Vijñaptimātra at the time of Ratatara Shanti and the very later Yogācāra scholars? What kind of ideas, how do their ideas differ from the classical Yogācāra, so to say?
I think, I don't study this stuff in much depth, so I don't want to say very much.
Just whatever you mind explain.
A couple hundred years after Vasubandhu and Asanga, we start to have the beginning of sectarianism. People who self-identify as Madhyamakas, Buddha Palita, Baba Viveka, and then of course Candrakīrti. And they are saying that the what they call Yogācārans, have said that, posited that mind exists substantially, that mind's not yet. And it's entirely possible that there were some other disciples or whatever, students of Vasubandhu, who kind of went off in that direction, because it's very easy when you start to think about how we experience the world, given our cognitive faculties, that in a certain sense that becomes even more important than the stimuli that we have coming in. And so there's an orientation to subjectivity in human experience there, that if you keep taking it in that same direction, one could say that mind and mind alone is sort of the ultimate reality. That moves away from sort of the idea about how an individual's cognitive processes operate to a much larger, maybe you might say metaphysical kind of discussion, and one that also brings in cosmology, you might say. Like, is the Dharmakaya conscious? Dharmakaya is probably conscious, and but not the Vijñana. So there's already a kind of a different frame of reference there. And I think that it's very likely that there are other people at that time who were saying things like mind is the only true existence. But we can say the same thing about emptiness. In fact, it shows up in the Saṃskāra Sutra. One of the reasons the Saṃskāra Sutra said that they needed to interpret the concept of emptiness, this is in the sutra, is because people thought that meant that nothing exists or that nothing matters. It was what we call the nihilistic interpretation of emptiness. So even at that time, there is recorded in the sutra, there were people who were promulgating, teaching a nihilistic interpretation of emptiness. So it is reasonable to infer that there were people who were giving an idealistic interpretation of Yogācāra. And so people are,
It's like a swing.
Yeah.
Like affirmative, negative.
Yeah.
So to say.
So I think this is part of the historical context of sectarianism, right? And then you get these Madhyamaka writers, and they say this is what Yogācārans say, and it's like, I look at what the Candrakīrti and Śāntideva say, and it's like, well, what text are they reading? I didn't read that in Saṃskāra and Vasubandhu. Did they not notice that dependent arising is front and center there? Did they not notice that the Vijñaptimātra is a critical concept, saying that we need to recognize that these things are products of complex, interactive cognitive processes, and not the description of the objects don't exist and the mind does? I don't know what text they're reading or who they're talking to.
It seems to me there must have been, like you're saying, there must have been a group who had misinterpreted.
Yes.
And there must be refuting this misconception of what was meant. I mean, that's the only explanation I can think of. Because obviously they're also considered bodhisattvas, right? To some, or I don't know exactly, bodhisattva, but they're considered great practitioners. It's hard for me also to put it in perspective, other than them refuting the misconception of Yogācāra theories rather than Yogācāra the theories themselves, as I understood
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is what was happening in India, right, at the time. But I'm also curious. Before you mentioned something a little bit about East Asia. Maybe we can take a little trip from the south to the east. And what happened? How did Yogācāra come? How is it understood?
Could we finish off the cognitive science house?
Oh yes, actually.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let's put that aside for a second.
Okay.
So as a consequence of the way that the Indian Buddhism has been introduced into the West, predominantly influenced by Tibetans and the Tenet system, Yogācāra has been sort of put into this category called Cittamātra. So anybody that has a certain kind of acquaintance with Indian Buddhism will probably, I mean, fairly deep one, will probably know this term Cittamātra more than Yogācāra. And that has really colored the way that a lot of Western Buddhists and then some of the cognitive scientists who are interested in Buddhism have thought about Yogācāra. So when they, and not only that, but Buddhist scholars, it's very interesting. There's at least 3 books that I know of fairly early on in the Buddhist studies world, 50s and 60s, I think, that give a really interesting interpretation of Pali Buddhism and cognitive theories and Pali texts. And they are what we might call constructivist, which is kind of what I think of Yogācāra. And they say it's constructivist and the mind is not kind of separate from these objects or objects separate from our categories, etc., right? And then they go, but we're not talking about Yogācāra. We're not talking about idealism, that stuff, because that's what they've heard, right? And so it's been shunted off into this, it's not worth, they're wrong, and we just need to learn about them so far as we can see that they're wrong. And so it's only been really recently in the West that people have started to challenge this interpretation. And then the cognitive scientists, are kind of slow to catch up on this. So some of the people who are really interested in cognitive science of meditation and things like that, their understanding of Yogācāra is that it's idealism. Still very largely that. So hopefully, they'll become interested in these other things, not with my book. And there's a cohort of us, of my generation, a little bit younger, who have a very similar idea, similar interpretation that I have, like Jonathan Gold and Dan Lesthouse, of course, who's older than I am, Karen Myers, who used to teach here at NRYI. So, yeah.
Actually, in my class also, I'm taking a class with Diane now, a research methodology class, and we're learning a Yogācāra text from her. And then I was surprised that everyone is interested in Yogācāra and Shinto, actually. In this class, I was like, wow.
Yeah.
It seems like there's something is happening, something is brewing.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting dimensions to this topic, which is part of one of the main parts of my paper that I'm just still working on, and that's do you look at the development of Buddhism historically, or do you think about it in terms of these categories of the Tenet system? And the Tenet systems are just not historical. I mean, they have roots in historical phenomenon, obviously, but they don't really map very well onto what we can see in terms of historical development. So you mentioned this earlier before about, you hadn't thought about looking at Yogācāra in terms of early Buddhism and Abhidharma. That's an historical perspective, right?
Yeah.
So where do we think new concepts come from? I mean, obviously, a certain kind of realization, for sure, but they're going to be couched in terms, if they're going to communicate skillfully, they're going to be couched in terms that the people will understand, which means historically situated, right? So just to not even think about a school like that as being historically situated is in a way to deny the dependent arising of doctrines.
Actually, if it was accurately historically situated, then Madhyamaka should go before and then Yogācāra, right?
Well, this is what the Saṃskāra Sutra does. Which of course is very controversial.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the tide is shifting in Western interpretations of Yogācāra, and the cognitive scientists will probably kind of, the ones who are interested in this will catch up because there's a lot of interesting parallels.
And going back to the term Yogācāra,
Yeah.
does it, why do you think, I mean, my understanding or maybe imagining this is that I imagine these Madhyamakas became really philosophers. They were philosophizing so much that they put the practice to the side. So that's why they call themselves, we are the ones who practice yoga. Or I don't know what. Why would they choose this word to name themselves as? Or what's your thought?
That's, I don't know any place where it's actually explained. I'm sure it is someplace. The example for the introduction of Vijñaptimātra in the Saṃskāra Sutra is, there are two examples. One is a reflection in the mirror, but the other one is an image conjured up during meditation, or maybe an image of, they don't quite say visualization, but having heard or teaching, and then you go in meditation, you contemplate, the Shruti Chinta Bhavana, right? You contemplate it. And meditation, and then what is in a sense, the status of these images. So this is a meditative practice, of course. So I think there's a lot of it was motivated by trying to make sense of what happens when we go into deep states of concentration.
And also, as far as I understand, if we read any meditation manual within the Tibetan tradition, in whether it's Gandok Sakya, Kajunima, Janan, they all seem to always, when it's about meditation practice, they always quote Yogācāra texts. They're never, even though their philosophy, ultimate philosophy is Madhyamaka, but in terms of practice, they always go back to Asanga.
Yeah, because they systematize the path system. The Bodhisattva path and stuff, and had all of these practices. So that they didn't, necessarily develop. They were also inherited, and they just from multiple traditions in India, and they put them together into a kind of a system that made sense. So, that's another reason.
Do you think there is also a connection between Vijñaptimātra and the term, which by the way is back translated into Sanskrit from the Tibetan Cittamātra? Do you think in a way they refer to that same idea? I mean, the etymologically speaking sounds similar to me. I don't know.
Yeah, and what came up the other day too, there's matra is used to modify a variety of nouns with much the same kind of sense, that is just that. It's not what you think it is. I forget what the other ones were, just I came across the other day. So it's we would say a privative, and that means it's depriving, right? Or negating something rather than asserting something. It's just a perception. It's just a perception that the shape and the categories, etc., are part of our dispositions, our citta. In that sense, it's not saying only citta exists, right? In this sense, it's a critical concept rather than an ontological one. And I think in the 20 verses, Vasubandhu says very clearly, he argues, with his imagined interlocutor, right? He says the interlocutor said, well, Vijñapti must exist, right? And so you're saying that it's the ultimate thing. And so therefore there's at least one kind of object that exists at the Vijñapti that isn't empty, as it were. He said, no, Vijñapti is also just another Vijñapti. And logically speaking, that's the same as the emptiness of emptiness, right? People would say things are empty of, Svabhāva, of their own essence. And they would say, well, the emptiness exists. And the Garjana, no, of course not. That's also empty. It serves as a limiting concept, a critical concept, not as an ontological reality. And I think that what Vasubandhu is doing in a lot of his texts is just transferring Nagarjuna's brilliant logical patterns away from semantics and logic towards cognitive processes. And so the whole question, for example, like, well, how could language work if it doesn't have an unchanging meaning? Well, it works because we agree on them. It's vyavahara, right? We agree, and obviously language changes all the time. It never stops changing, but it is practical, and we agree upon it. Well, and then Vasubandhu that's his same answer in the 20 verses. How come then we see things that are common? Obviously there must be an objective world. He said, no, we have common conditions for perception, which isn't just our human embodiment with our particular kinds of faculties. It's culture. We have names and we have categories and predispositions, etc. So people don't all see the same things, if they come from really different backgrounds, for example.
Well, that's such an interesting view of Vasubandhu
Yeah.
refurbishing of Nagarjuna. I find it very, very fascinating. And that actually brings me to a question I had for you that I have forgotten now. It came to mind.
Okay.
How would you, because my understanding is that Yogācāra also leads one to the same result of understanding emptiness using the three nature system. How would you define, or what do you see are the difference in which emptiness is described from Madhyamaka or Yogācāra?
Well, the classic sort of articulation in Yogācāra is the emptiness of subject and object, right? And that right there is already a direct reflection of the whole formula of dependent arising. Dependent arising, something depends on the faculty, and then there's awareness of it, right? So there's always this sort of bifurcation, you could say. And the problem is that we imagine that we're totally separate from the world around us, and that we have this sort of completely objective understanding of the world. And both the objects and subjects are things that are constructed. A sense of objectivity, a sense of subjectivity are deeply constructed. And we see this in the early Pali texts as well. I mean, there's no question about that, really. And the Arjuna and the Madhyamaka, at the risk of generalizing, seem to focus a lot on the ontology of objects. So there's an expression that I learned when I was studying with the Glupas for many years, which I deeply appreciate, and learning the Arjuna and Madhyamaka at that level. What is it on its own side? So what is a bottle on its own side? That's imaginary. We can talk about objects as they are in and of themselves, separate from our engagement with it, as if it exists and without us having categories and names, etc. Now, obviously, they say that it's name only, so they use provisional prajnapti, a dependent designation, to say, well, yes, it's not really on its own side. It depends on the designation. But then the next question would be, I think you're anticipating this. The next question is, well, where does that designation come from? It doesn't fall out of the sky. It comes from, our minds and our Vāsanā and our Vikalpa and all of that. So there's this ontological orientation that we see with the Madhyamakans and the Glupas, which I think needs to be kind of balanced, and kind of put back into the context of dependent arising. And this is what the Yogācārans are saying. You have to take into account both of these very deeply.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Do we want to talk about East Asia then?
Yeah.
Or when is it not forget?
Yeah. I had another, but no. For now, I lost the other question and regarding the.
Mm-hmm.
1 hour. Yeah, it's interesting how fast.
Yeah,
Disney doesn't seem so.
Yeah. Are you following everything?
Yeah, I'm not completely a scholar,
Yeah.
like how he is, like how you know.
Yeah.
For me, it's just based on my interest something. So I'm not really too familiar with some of the terms. So it's hard for me to follow when these terms come up. But then again, I really enjoy how you spoke about, I don't know, I've been always, I speak with him, like interested the consciousness. In science, they call it the heart problem. I don't know, but I listen to the scientists talk about this. But I don't know. Some say it's the product of the brain itself.
Yeah. So the real question is, how do we know anything about the brain if we're not conscious?
Conscious,
So being conscious is a precondition for talking about brains as an object of perception. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about another question. This one is, for example, in my practice, now we have a form, right? If I don't have a form, I don't know what is a Vedana, the sensation.
Yeah.
If there is no Vedana, what do you mean by Sangya?
Right.
And the Saṃskāra seems to be quite a complicated. It's not easy to digest as how it's easy to, just simply point out, okay, this is Vedana, this is Sangya. Saṃskāra seems to be quite on another level.
Yeah.
But I don't know what a mind is without the body, and neither do I know what a body is without the mind.
Right.
If I don't have a mind, I don't know what. And they talk about things such as arupa loka.
Yeah.
And I completely okay, what is it? Because for me, in my experience, just because I'm experienced doesn't mean it's the same thing.
No.
But then again, it makes me wonder sometimes, just what could it be, this arupa loka, What do they experience in arupa loka, So these are some of the questions that because
One way to think about this, a fairly simple way, I think, is to remember that, and I'm sure you're very well aware of this, the world is full of all kinds of beings that we can't see with our eyes, right? The nags,
Yes.
For example, and then bhut, ghosts, and devas. And so they don't have the same kinds of rupa that we have. And, modern scientific people would say, well, that's just all a bunch of nonsense. But we're talking about states of mind that people can get into that are, in a sense, immaterial, or at least have subtle matter. And then states of being that have subtle matter rather than this kind of gross matter. In rupa, one of the definitions of rupa, how you probably know this, is pratika, right? It's resistance. Pratika also means aggression, but it means resistance. So a typical Theravada discussion about materiality, about rupa, is that which provides resistance. And now we know from physics, resistance is just about electromagnetic fields. Right? It's not stuff. Matter is not matter. Not really.
They have this quantum,
Yeah.
those vibrating particles. They seem to have all the string theory now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before it was, I guess, just atoms. Then they dissected the atom also. Then they come up to, I don't know, electron. And now they're saying, everything is just a vibrating.
Right. So our whole cultural sense of what matter is something that has come about really in the modern world with physics. And now, of course, it's being challenged by quantum mechanics, etc. And so it's the modern scientific worldview, it's just a few hundred years old, and of course it's a hegemonic worldview. Everybody will say it's real, and anything that disagrees with that is just nonsense.
But if people actually believe that, they wouldn't be acting this way anymore. I mean, if that was ontologically speaking, that was a fact that this is just an empty wave half the time. Mirror, right? If we actually took that as the foundation of our view, we would also be acting very differently, right?
If we recognize that, for example, there was these effects of our actions, our body, speech, and mind that ripple out and are going to always have this effect, which is karma, right? Yeah, if people believed in karma, they would act differently.
I was listening to the scientists also talk, and we're also talking in the sense of ripples.
Yeah.
Of reality, where the matter also being, like ripples in the, I don't know, ocean, something like that. Well, I also heard about the way Buddha described about the five skandhas. I don't know the Pali word. I don't know exactly, but he just gave like an example. One of my uncle, he told me this. He said, Rupa Khanda, it's like the fizz of a soap, like the fizz.
Yeah.
And the Vedana skandha,
Form, I think we could say.
yeah, Rupa is the fizz,
Yeah.
like, and then the Vedana is like Bubulopama. That Upama means, he said, it's like an example, for example, Upu. So Bubulopama, like a bubbles. And then he described Sangya, perception, as this Marichikopama, meaning it's like an illusion, like sometimes, like I was listening to you speak and it completely made sense what he was talking.
Right.
He said sometimes in the road, especially in the West, there's this big highways and it looks as if it's water from far away, but when you go near, it's not.
Right.
And he said, perception, sanya is something like that.
Yeah.
It looks something, but it's not.
Right.
And then he talked about Saṃskāra as a big banana tree,
Yeah.
that when you peel it off, it's just nothing. Yeah. It looks like it's something else. And then he talked about Vijñana Mayo, something Mayas. He said something like Vijñana is something like a magician showing us things here. Then, suddenly not sure. It's like a magician
Yeah.
doing things, here, like, I don't know. That's how, they are the Pali words, but I don't know much, but this was how he explained.
The magic show, yeah. This is an analogy that's used all the way through from the Buddha to today. And in the Sālidhumacchana Sutra, it opens up with the magic show. I mean, at first there's a context, that's a context and stuff, but then Bodhisattva is in the magic show, Bodhisattvas have to act in a way that can be understood and meaningful to an audience. But that doesn't mean they think that those things are real. They say the same thing about Cittamātra and Vijñāna. These are not necessarily real, but they're really useful concepts, which is another reason why they're not said to be substantially existent. The text always undermined this notion that these concepts are anything that is impressionability. But then you get into all kinds of other parts of Buddhism with Tantra and Mahamudra and Dzogchen, and the language starts to sound a lot like it's, mind is the foundation of reality, of everything.
Actually, I was thinking about this idea of Vijñaptimātra and this idea of how the systematization, the doxography, Tibetan doxography of Cittamātra and all.
Yeah.
And actually, I have read a few Mahamudra manuals within the Kagyu, such as the Nine Karma Bus, Dapotashi Namgyal's Moonmeans of Mahamudra. There's another one by the Third Kamtrul Rinpoche, the Royal Seal of Mahamudra. They all start in the beginning. They say that mind is the basis of everything, and they quote a bunch of sutras, Yogācāra sutras, saying that. So it's like, the way I see it is just is like they're using Vijñaptimātra as a stepping stone, I guess. Or how do you see that? What's your thought on that?
Well, my first approach is that this term mind and consciousness has many different meanings. It has many sort of different dimensions of what levels of thinking about it. And so there are cognitive applications of these terms. So we can talk about how perception operates, and we use Chitta and Manas and Vijñāna and Ālaya Vijñāna in that context, right? That's a specific kind of context. And that's the context in which the idea of Yogācāra as Cittamātra, they're saying that Yogācārans say that Chitta and Vijñāna exist substantially, right? It's idealism. Whereas I think from a point of view of the text, the Yogācāra text up into Vasubandhu and the Asanga, they see this as all dependent arising. And so it's not idealism in that sense, in the context of human or kind of ordinary cognition, more or less. When you move into a much larger frame of reference, what is the universe ultimately? What is Dharmakaya ultimately? Then that's just a different context. And I think that one needs to be careful about the context in which these terms are used. And so the Saṃskāra Sutra also, I keep mentioning this because it's kind of the main Yogācāra text. It also says that, everything exists primordially in a state of peace, of nirvana. And that when one sort of realizes nirvana, not a single thing has changed. Which is actually a passage which is also quoted in the Vijñaptimātra, the perfection of wisdom. So they're just sort of introducing a level of talking about reality itself as at some level sentient. And I just think those need to be, obviously they can't be totally separated because we're part of Dharmakaya, right? If Dharmakaya is reality and reality is conscious, where are we going to go that we're not part of Dharmakaya, right? Obviously nowhere. So that's also part of our own ultimate nature. But that is a different thing than talking about the minutiae of perceptual processes. And it's because we cling on to this sort of individuality, habitual, or, over how many lifetimes we are habituated to clinging to our individuality, that this is all that we understand and perceive, right? And that if we're awakened beings don't see that, they don't have those kinds of limitations. So we need to start with where we are. And part of where we are is imagining that the world of perception tells us, that we're separate from everything else. And so that's why there are all of these analyses of cognitive processes, because that's a place that has to start, but that's not where they finish. And it's not even where we would say start, you might say ontologically or intermetaphysically, because from a Mahāyāna point of view, we're always are and always have been part of Dharmakaya. So this is a new framing. You talked about recycling. This is part of how I think about what is going on in early Mahāyāna. Is you have this continuity of analysis of perceptual and cognitive processes. You have this complex Abhidharma analyses, which sort of works out the language in much more precision, but then creates problems of continuity in the context of momentariness. And then that sort of continues on to give, within Mahāyāna traditions, to give us a method of analyzing cognitive processes in a language, in a set of meditative practices. But at the same time, that sort of, if I may, Hinayana, scare quotes, sort of persist in, you see stuff like this in Śāntideva for sure, right? The body is just full of all this nasty pus. I thought we're supposed to see the world in terms of a nectar, right? And everything else, right? So that was Śāntideva. Early, right? This is the strong continuity of pre-Mahāyāna idea, dualistic ways of thinking. But then early Mahāyāna with the Prajnaparamita and Samdhinamochana, etc., introduce a non-dual paradigm. And the non-dual paradigm is the ground, and then the problem, the path, and then the results. So it's a result-based, right? We're already Dharmakaya, we just don't realize it. So that's the reframing that goes on, I think, in early Mahāyāna. Within that reframing, we can still use Abhidharma modes of talking, and Yogācāra Abhidharma modes of things like Ālaya Vijñāna. But that's contextualized by this larger notion of, for lack of a better word, Buddha nature, or Dharmakaya, which has always already been there. That's in the frame for looking at all these cognitive processes and analyze them so we can get rid of the veils of individuality that we deeply, deeply believe in and hold on to.
I'm glad you brought this term. I'm glad to hear you say Buddha nature,
Yeah.
because that's also something I was curious about. As I understand, this idea of Tathagata was accepted. It seems to me, based on my recent historical readings, that we can even say there were three different currents of Mahayana in India, in early Mahayana. Would be Yogācāra, Madhyamaka, and then the Tathagata also had their own thing happening.
Yeah.
So would you say that the Sandhini Sutra teaches Tathagata implicitly without using the vocabulary then?
Yeah, I don't know how you cannot say that. Yes. I mean, that's what and this is in the Prajnaparamita too. I just came across a note, I think, from Lamont, great Belgian scholar, French writer anyways, that's in the Prajnaparamita as well. This is underlying reality, is where we're already awakened, we're sort of the same nature.
Because I have also read some people who claim that the idea of Buddha nature or nature originated from within Yogācāra, but that doesn't seem to be the case, especially when we talk about the 5 gotras, right? As expressed in, I think, the Mahāyāna Sutta Ālankara, I think, right?
Well, there's going to be, even within the classical texts of Yogācāra, there's some differences between things. So the Uttara Tantra, right? The what is it? Gyume? Yeah, Gyulama. That's kind of a Tathagata text, and that's sort of an outlier in a certain sense. But still, you look at things like the Sandhini Sutra, and they're saying, well, everything has always already been primordially in a state of peace, of nirvana. And nothing has been passed over when one becomes liberated. So I think that this is just a
semantical difference, maybe?
Well, there's a lot of semantics involved in this whole discussion, for sure. I think ultimately this is a Mahayana too, with not very many exceptions. Now they don't, the arguments are all going to be about, is this essentializing, and what does that mean to say it's permanent, and etc. They're going to argue back and forth endlessly in every Mahayana country. But ultimately, that's one of the things I think that distinguishes Mahayana from non-Mahayana Buddhist tradition.
So then, speaking of the broad Mahayana traditions, I also understand that the way that the Tathagata doctrine and the way that Yogācāra developed once it leaves India, not to go over the Himalayas to Tibet, but into China, Korea, Japan.
Right.
Would you talk a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah, and that's not, again, that's not my field of research, but I did study a little bit in graduate school, and a bunch of my friends are scholars of Chinese Buddhism and Chinese Yogācāra, so I learned from them. Basically, Tathagata ideas get blended in with Yogācāra ideas in this text called The Awakening of Mahayana Phase, which is probably composed, some other scholars think it was composed in Central Asia, and probably not originally in Sanskrit. And nevertheless, it was taken to be, by most of the Mahayana schools in China, taken to be authoritative. And so Tathagata kinds of ideas ended up becoming, in a sense, the basic orientation of Chinese Buddhism, with a few exceptions. And so this means that we're already, everybody has Buddha nature, we're just the veil of ignorance, and self-clinging, we can't see that, and we just need to clean the veil, etc. And so that's sort of the assumption for most of East Asian Buddhism, though you get the people who are doing practice, meditation practice, I should say, as opposed to, Pure Land traditions, which in a sense you pray to Amitabha to be reborn in his presence. But slowly through their practice, they realize that, of course, there's no difference between Amitabha and one's own mind. So that's just another more roundabout way of getting at to this. The foundation of our being is already awakened, the Buddha mind. Buddha Amitayas Samadhi Sutra, is that the name of it? Amitayas. The meditation on Buddha Amitaya says that our mind is Buddha mind. It's not different than Amitabha. There's just another way around that. But what is really interesting about this part of East Asian Buddhism is that Tathagata is kind of its default position, is every once in a while you get, especially more recently, you get East Asian scholars who kind of come to Indian sources and they read Nagarjuna and they read Candrakīrti, and then they start to become and Tsongkhapa, and they start to be very critical of Tathagata. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there was a very small movement in Japan in the 90s, in the odds, but particularly in the 90s, called Hihan Bukkyo, critical Buddhism. Have you heard of it?
Oh, you mentioned. I heard it from you.
Okay.
But you please
Well,
wait for it.
Great scholars. I mean, I know one of them, Hakamaya Sensei, great Yogācāra scholar. I mean, he just produced so much. And I depended a lot on his work for my own thesis and stuff like that. They just said this isn't Tathagata is not Buddhism. It's just sort of Vedanta. It's Hinduism in disguise, and because those things are permanent and unchanging, and it's foundationalist. And he made a big splash, but I don't think he made a lot of influence, because it's this notion of hongaku, innate awareness, innate awakening is really deep-seated in East Asian Buddhism.
He cannot destroy 1,000+ years of tradition.
No.
Yeah.
But what it does shows, what I take away from that is that there's just sort of a deep tension between something like Buddha nature as permanent and unchanging and always there, and everything being hipped, and without essence. And some of this, of course, is semantics, and but it was debatable in India. I mean, debated deeply, debated in Tibet, debated in China, Japan, debated in Western Buddhism now. And how do we reconcile this deep sense in practice of consciousness being fundamental, and our analytic mind saying, well, that doesn't sound right?
It seems that the path of logic leads to negation, and the path of experience leads to fullness, I guess.
Yeah.
That's
So emptiness is form and form is...
And then, but basically, just to put it in a very straightforward way, the Zen people in Japan and Korea and the Chan people in China, they're Yogācārists, right?
Oh, well, yeah, by and large. They've been deeply influenced more by the Lankavatara Sutra than the Samdhinamanja Sutra, but yes, in a sense. Though they haven't, they don't necessarily study the Lankavatara Sutra a lot or study Yogācāra a lot, but it was very formative in the beginning of Chan, which then, of course, got transmitted to Korea and Japan. It was very formative. And now, very interestingly, I think, a lot of the Zen people in the West are kind of looking to have a little bit more sort of formal analysis of how mind operates. And so the Chan, after formation, Chan and Zen traditions tend to mostly just get rid of all of the formal doctrines and everything and make up their own literature, with koans and things like that. But those aren't anywhere near as rigorous and systematic analyses of mind that you see, of mind and mental processes that you see in India. And so they're sort of, I've been invited to a couple of Zen places in the US and was explicitly told, be helpful for us to have some more sort of systematic Buddhist ideas about how mind operates rather than just what this wonderful Zen literature does. So Yogācāra is kind of their go-to.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah.
It's wonderful that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in that sense, I guess I'm kind of helpful that Yogācāra is can come out of the closet and not be under wraps, the Cittamātra wraps, so to speak. And we can look at it, a little bit more empathetically and see what it does for us. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, my intention with us having this conversation is to take it out of the closet also.
Yeah. And I think that this is sort of repeating this paper that I've been obsessing over for the last 2 months. I think that the relationship of we might say the contents of Ālaya Vijñāna, well, these are metaphors that they're concrete metaphors which can be misleading, but the ways that we have been, we would say, socialized and acculturated to thinking and feeling and experience the world in certain kinds of categories, that's the way that we experience the world in terms of these categories. There's no real separation between kind of our cultural and social lives and what's going on, you could say, in these really deep recesses of our minds. This is the language that fits really easily into the language of social psychology or sociology and depth psychology, right? This is how we're socialized and acculturated. This is exactly what this whole Ālaya, relation of Ālaya and Vāsanā loka is all about. And of course, bodies, neurologically embedded categories.
Actually, you just reminded me a question I had for you.
Yeah.
So there's this notion from Jung about the collective unconscious, right?
Yeah.
But then from the Yogācāra perspective, as I understand, the Ālaya is a personal.
With both.
It's both.
Yeah, it has.
Like how, because if we were to somehow describe these two things as having some common denominator, how do you reconcile this collective theme from Jung, where all these archetypes and these mythologies in the world come from, etc., and Ālaya, personal Ālaya idea, Yogācāra?
So the personal one is pretty simple. I got a really bad headache now. Oh. You don't actually know, do you? If I do or don't. I don't. That's my personal. That's what the text says. That's the personal, the uncommon, asadharana. Nyamon epe, I think. What is it? Nyamon? What is it? Common? Uncommon?
Tumon
Tumon, yes. Tumon epa.
Actually, Tumon is common, Tumon Mayimpa is uncommon.
Yeah. So the uncommon, Tumon Mayimpa, Kushinan Parsheba, it is connected to the sense faculties. The common one is connected to language. So when I say it's sunny outside, or even I say a headache, we had a common perception there, more or less. We understood. So,
but we had a nampa, no? I had mine. You had your nampa. I had a nampa here. His nampa.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah, but they're still similar.
How can we know that?
How do you know whether you understood me or not?
No, but okay, I agree that we are labeling it, right?
Yeah.
We all are using the same label, but there's no way for me to know exactly what they meant or what my idea of that was.
You don't have to know exactly. It's behavioral, pragmatic, right? You understood, and we could tell that you understood. This is our Svasaṃvedana. We are aware that we understood each other. And Vasubandhu, in his commentary on the Dharma Dharmadalibhāga, talks about that a couple of places. It's kind of interesting. He says that actually we don't have exactly the same experience, right?
But we had similar enough that we communicated clearly and knew that we were communicating. So we have a different, that's what they mean by shared. I think that I'm not sure how, translating that term is tricky, because when we say something is shared or common, we imagine that it's exactly the same. But, maybe we share a birthday, we're still different people. I'm a Gemini. How about you?
Cancer.
Into okay.
Right next to each other.
Yes.
Capricorn.
Capricorn. Yes.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense, actually. It's yeah.
Yeah, and Vasubandhu says, he says it's individuals who are experiencing something similar. So, and the example I use in my book is if everybody's watching the World Cup, lots of people watch the World Cup at the same time. I mean, all over the world, right? And yeah, but we're all having somewhat of an individual experience, but it's also obviously deeply shared, as is language and culture. It is deeply shared. I mean, it's exactly the same. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that's one part of it. But then you get into the other part, like you mentioned, about archetypes, right, and mythologies and stuff like that. I think this is actually, and I haven't gone into these commentaries on like early tantras and stuff like that. The Guhya Samatra shows up around the same time as classical Yogācāra. So early tantra is showing up then. Why are these kinds of images evocative for us? I don't know if I have any images right now, but images of, because we have lots of images, but like I'm tantric images. Images of sex and violence are very evocative for human beings, like everywhere. This would be, the ethologists, the people who study behavior would say, well, obviously, we're mammals, we reproduce, we want to stay alive, we have deep kinds of resonances with things that are threatening and also enticing. And so do, the dogs downstairs and stuff. These are saṃskāras. We have deep common saṃskāras the world over. And of course, there are cultural differences and stuff like that, but a whole lot of them are really similar. That's why we can relate to other cultures easily. We can go and acculturate somewhere else. These are kinds of saṃskāras, I think. And yeah, there's a lot of neo-colonial type stuff going on with Hume and other funky stuff with Freud, no doubt. But I don't think it's a coincidence that the Yogācāra analyses of how mind operates at deep levels was what is typically used to explain what are going on in Tantra, if they want to not use explicitly sort of tsalum vocabulary, right? So like the Panchabuddha mandalas and stuff, they're using Yogācāra vocabulary for that. And I think that's a really neat bridge that people should study more.
Yeah, to be honest, I feel like Tantra has, of course, is based on both Madhyamaka and Yogācāra, but it's a little bit more Yogācāra leaning. I feel like, actually, I was just reading in the morning a book by Trale Rinpoche, which is the influence of Yogācāra on Tantra.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, which is very similar.
Mahamudra or Tantra?
I'm sorry. Oh, Mahamudra, actually, you're right. Yeah, Mahamudra. You read that book, I guess. Yeah, it's a little bit oversimplified, I guess, but it presents a general concept. It's just like a good general presentation, I guess, and he makes good points.
The thing is, and some people won't like this, but it's not enough to just say stuff is empty. We also want to understand how our minds operate. We have to work with them. We have to work with these energies. We need more concepts for that.
I think this hits the spot on this line.
That's why we have to use these systems of analysis and the meditation practices that go with them. And yeah, they're all empty. That's good, but to remember that, always remember that, because we're prone to reification. But we need these tools. Yeah.
And thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is wonderful.
Okay, so what is? Okay, all right. Well, yes.
Any last comments? Anything else you wanna say before we?
No, I just people try and do the best they can. It's a tough time we live in. Yeah. I will say something. You know, I teach at an undergraduate institution in U.S. and a lot of international students too. They're all 18 to 22. You know, it's just that kind of an institution, and they're sensitive, smart, caring people, and they're so confused. The world we live in is so full of so many contradictory things, and everything is analyzed until we can't believe anything about anything, and it's a really challenging time, I think, to be young. And I feel so grateful that I have been able to spend my life with the Buddhist traditions, and the world makes sense to me, you know, because of Buddhism, and we can make sense of how this craziness. It's not something beyond our understanding, but we need these tools, both conceptual and emotional, spiritual tools to deal with it all. So, you know, I have a lot of faith in Buddhist traditions to help people. That's my motivation.
No, thank you for saying that. That's wonderful. Yeah, I think we all do here also. This we intend to for sure. Yeah. No, thank you so much, Bill.
Okay, well, my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.